The idea that Jesus never existed has been one of the biggest causative factors in the death of Christianity. And the faith of most young Christians does not survive college and university. But in these dark times, many people, desperate for an antidote to the lies, cruelty and depravity of our atheist culture, are taking another look at Christianity. And this video is for them. This video gives these good people archaeological proof that Jesus and the Jesus family really did exist. Originally, this video was part of a series, but this is the complete director's cut. There are some Christians, and you'll meet some of them in this video, who are terrified that reality will destroy their faith. You'll probably see their hateful comments below. But faith is not faith if it fears reality. Faith, it's true, gives you insights that logic can't reach, but once understood, truth does not contradict logic. Reason itself comes from God. This video is dedicated to all those who follow Jesus and would have given their lives to save his.
On the 27th of March 1980, a construction crew in Israel accidentally uncovered the underground tomb of the Jesus family.
It was Friday afternoon. Just under my window, there was a construction site. In order to build, they would blast the mountain with dynamite. As curious kids, we would run to see the explosions. After one blast, once the dust faded away, I saw a burial tomb. Above its entrance was a triangle and a circle.
In the spring of 1980, in Tel Piot, South Jerusalem, construction blasting exposed the entrance to a burial tomb. It was 2,000 years old.
In 2007, writer and director James Cameron, famous for his films Avatar and Titanic, made a documentary with Simcha Jacobovici entitled The Lost Tomb of Jesus. And I'm willing to bet that you've never even heard of that documentary. And there's a very good reason why you've never heard of that documentary, and it's not the reason that you would imagine. This video will expose the truth, and the truth is that for the last 40 years, Christian pseudo-academics have been doing everything that they can to rebury the Jesus of history.
Well, the serious scholars I look at in regard to the Jesus tomb, they all reject it.
But even if it does say Jesus, son of Joseph, such inscriptions were found on many ancient tombs because the names were so common.
Stay with me while we reopen the Jesus family tomb, and I give you a summary in this first of a series of videos examining the Jesus family tomb, the Jesus of history, and prove the validity of the claims made by Simcha Jacobovici and James Cameron.
So what happened? What did we actually find in 1980? Let me tell you the sad tale of possibly the worst excavation in the history of archaeology. During construction work for a housing complex at Tel Piot, some 5 kilometres south of Jerusalem's old city, routine blasting exposed the facade of a 1st century Hebrew burial tomb. Civil engineer Ephraim Shohat notified the Israeli Antiquities Authority. They sent out archaeologist Elliot Brown to investigate. It was Thursday the 27th of March 1980. He found an exposed rock-cut tomb with a unique facade with a chevron and a circle cut in it, not seen before or since. There was no rock covering the 18-inch by 18-inch entrance, and soil had obviously washed in and half filled the tomb. Mr. Brown was just about able to make out 10 ossuaries, or the tops of 10 ossuaries, within the tomb. Eventually, district archaeologist Amos Cluner took over supervision of the site. He appointed IAA archaeologist Joseph Gath to carry out the excavation. Gath, in turn, invited a young student, Shimon Gibson, to draw the layout of the tomb. Around noon on Friday the 28th of March, the day after the tomb was first exposed, and an 11-year-old schoolboy named Oriel Moath, whose Orthodox Jewish family lived nearby, passed by the site and saw the distinctive facade. He ran home and told his mother, Rivka Moath, who called the IAA office as the tomb was exposed and it looked like the builders were going to destroy it. There were no archaeologists working on that Friday afternoon, and Mrs. Moath could not reach anyone at the offices of the IAA. The next day, the Saturday, was the Shabbat, and young Oriel was on his way home from synagogue. He saw children playing with the bones and playing football with the skulls from the tomb. The tomb had been left unguarded since the Friday afternoon, and Mrs. Moath went out and chased the children away and collected what bones she could save. On Sunday, the 30th of March, she gave that bag of bones to Joseph Gath, the site archaeologist, who those bones should have been given to Joey Zayas, who was the anthropologist for the Rockefeller Museum. He normally receives all the bones from excavation. He tells us he has no record of ever receiving them or examining them. He has never filed a report on the Talpiot tomb bones. Young Gibson arrived, and in his initial testimony, he said he recalled seeing the ossuaries and that they had been removed from the tomb and were lined up ready for collection. He added that Gath took him inside the tomb and showed him the imprints of where the ossuaries had stood, so he must have completed his diagram, his famous diagram, on the Sunday the 30th of March. Joseph Gath did not publish a full report on the contents of the garden tomb, the Talpiot tomb, and the bones were never examined by Zayas. In 1996, Amos Cluner quietly published a paper on the tomb. Cluner insists that all the ossuaries were removed on the Friday afternoon, but the Moaz family and their frantic phone calls to the office of the IAA are evidence against this assertion. Cluner reports that he can find no record that would match up the ossuaries and their catalogue numbers with the original locations in the tomb from Gibson's map, which is obviously now worse than useless. The 10th ossuary went missing and cannot be found at the Rockefeller Museum. Amos Cluner insists that the 10th ossuary was damaged and was therefore stored somewhere else, unspecified, and as a result cannot be found. For anyone who has not been involved with archaeology in the past, it might be helpful to point out at this point that archaeology often deals with broken objects on a regular basis. So the ossuaries found inside the tomb had the names of the Jesus family. First, of course, is Yeshua bar Yosef, which is Aramaic for Jesus, son of Joseph. Then we had Maria, written in Aramaic script, but a Latin form of the Hebrew name, Miriam. This Latin form of the Hebrew name, written in Aramaic, is unique out of 2,000 ossuaries found. Then there's the ossuary Yossi, a diminutive of Joseph, mentioned as the name of one of Jesus' brothers in the New Testament. Then there's Judah bar Yeshua, which is Judah, son of Jesus. And then, of course, there's Mariamene Imara.
Mariamne is the same woman as Mary of Magdala, or Mary Magdalene, in the Synoptic Gospels and in some non-canonical texts like the Gospel of Mary, Pistis Sophia, etc.
In Greek, this reads Mariamene, known as Mara. The next ossuary was Mattia, which is another Hebrew form of Matthew. And then lastly, but not least, is the 10th and missing ossuary, which has been proved to have been from the Talpiot tomb. Yaakov bar Yosef Akui de Yeshua, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, which was obviously stolen. So let me give you a brief summary of the problems with this excavation, if we can call it that. Number one, the names. Well, the official story, despite the fact that the ossuaries had engraving detailing the principal names from the Jesus family, Cluna and his team decided, unilaterally we would assume, that the names were common and the tomb was of no special interest. They've been telling everybody this ad nauseum for the last 40 years. The unofficial story, however, is that Joseph Gath was terrified that the tomb belonged to the Jesus of history, and its discovery by Jewish people in Israel would make Christian anti-Semitism worse. We know this because his widow told us so. As we proved in our paper, and we will detail in our next video, just because a series of names may be common, it doesn't mean that a specific group of names is common. Even if we assume that Hebrew people of the 1st century only had 16 names to choose from, finding a tomb with 4 members of a specific family would be 65,536 to 1. In other words, you would have to open 65,536 tombs to find another similar group. The truth is that there are almost 2,800 names in the Hebrew Bible, and in the 1st century, people often used Greek names. Number 2, recording of the site. It was worse than useless. Gibson was only a student at the time, so we could perhaps forgive him. But Gath and Cluna should have known better. We can't even say which ossuary belonged where. Number 3, care of the human remains. Zayas, without any embarrassment, tells anyone who asks that no human material from the Talpiot tomb reached him. And for all we know, Joseph Gath could have thrown the body of a Jesus of history in the trash. Number 4, control of the site. Well, in short, there was none. Sometime after noon on the Friday, the 10th ossuary went missing. Shortly after that, a famous collector, Oded Golan, acquired the James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, ossuary. After 12 years in court, patina tests as well as a recent soil sample, the ossuary has been proved to come from the Jesus family tomb. It is obvious that either Cluna and his team are the worst archaeologists in history, or they believe they had a very good reason to rebury the Jesus of history forever. Did they sell the James ossuary to Oded Golan? I don't know. Maybe they were glad to dump the ossuary where no one would ever believe it came from the Jesus family tomb. Most notably, Professor André Lemaire, who is the greatest Semitic epigraphist in the world and is based at the Sorbonne University in Paris, France, confessed the ossuary, the James ossuary, is absolutely authentic. But there are political and religious forces interested in making the find disappear. And didn't they do a very good job?
In this video, I'll firstly introduce you to each of the people whose sad remains were found in the Jesus family tomb and were so poorly treated by that team. And we'll analyse each of those names in the context of the historical documents, not all of the historical documents, not just the ones that Christians approve of. And secondly, we'll examine the most popular objections made by the pseudo-scholars of Christian academia, and I'll show you the links that they will go to make sure that nobody ever finds out about the Jesus of history.
In this first section of the video, we'll examine each of the ossuaries in turn in order to give you historical and textual context. Jesus, son of Joseph, Yeshua bar Yosef. It's true that in 1st century Judea, the name Yeshua, which in English is Jesus, was not exactly uncommon. But as we've only found 21 ossuaries out of the 600 inscribed ossuaries found, the name Yeshua is not exactly common, with a percentage of only 3.9%.
The archaeological record shows that the custom of using ossuaries for burial in Jerusalem only lasted for about 100 years, ending around 70 of the Common Era when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. And so the discovery of inscriptions on stone coffins like these provide archaeologists with a catalog of names specific to the time of Jesus. And on one of the ossuaries discovered in the Talpiot tomb, written in Aramaic, was an astonishing name: Yeshua Bar Yosef. Shin, Vav, Ayin, Jesus. Bet, Resh, son of. Yud, He, Vav, Samech, Pei, Joseph.
Interestingly, out of thousands of tombs found, only one other ossuary has ever been found in 1926 with the two names Yeshua and Yosef, Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus son of Joseph. Other tombs have had residents with the name Yeshua, but none of the other occupants of those tombs had names from the Jesus family. We know very little of Maria. Yossi, brother of Jesus. We know very little of Yossi, apart from the fact that he was one of the brothers of the Jesus of history. This unusual spelling of the more common Joseph is mentioned in Mark 6:3. It's a Hebrew custom that someone with a nickname must have that name on the tomb. Mattia, or Matthew, the brother of the Jesus of history, is more interesting. Epiphanius tells us that the Nazarenes used a book in Hebrew that was written by Matthew. But he mentions that he didn't think it was the Gospel of Matthew with the genealogy. Papias, earlier, tells us much more about that book. He tells us that it was a collection of oracles or sayings of the Jesus of history written in Hebrew. Now, we have no idea who wrote the gospel that the church arbitrarily attributed to Matthew. Whoever did write the Gospel of Matthew didn't write it in Hebrew and was inherently anti-Semitic. Papias could have only been talking about the common source document Q. It may well be that the ossuary of Mattia contains the remains of the man who wrote the common source. Mary Magdalene. We have already discussed the tomb of Mary Magdalene in part 1 of this video series, but for the sake of completeness I'll repeat myself here. We know that the Jesus of history had a constant companion, a woman who was with him when he died, who washed his naked dead body and was still a big part of the movement after Jesus died. Now, was her name Maria, Mary, Mariam, Mariamene? We can't say for sure, but the big question is, was she his wife? The problem is that the Roman Catholic Church has spent 1,500 years telling everyone that had listened that this woman, the companion, was a prostitute. Now, since 1969, everyone admits it was a lie, but that mea culpa is about 2,000 years too late. So, what's the truth? We know that in Hebrew culture, a woman that close to a religious leader could have only been his mother, sister, or his wife. And for the sake of his family, the Jesus of history would have had to be married to the companion who was constantly with him and his family. From a Jewish point of view, it's a ridiculous question. Of course she was his wife. The Jesus wife papyrus was claimed as being a fraud. The world mass media gleefully trumpeted to the world that it was a fraud. Unfortunately for them, it's been proved to be genuine despite the sleeper agents of Christian pseudo-academia. Judas, son of Jesus. In the Acts of the Apostles 13:6, his name is first listed as son of Jesus, Bar Yeshua. The writer of Acts names him later in the text as Elmas, which would be something like God rejects in Hebrew, so we can't really understand why they referred to him as son of Jesus in the first place. The entire scene doesn't make much sense. Objections used by pseudo-academics. The first of our soldiers of Christ is Daniel B. Wallace from the Dallas Theological Seminary.
Actually, this is probably where I'd have a disagreement with Daryl. I think they did find Jesus' bones in the Talpiot tomb. And the reason we know that it was Jesus is because on the left wrist there was a little wristband and it said, "What would I do?" Had to be Jesus.
Oh, man.
Okay, people, move along. There's nothing to see.
Now, you may remember Wallace from the 1st century Mark debacle, in which he claimed that Papyrus 137 was a 1st century copy of the Gospel of Mark in order to defeat Professor Bart Ehrman in a debate. It wasn't, and he didn't. So when it comes to false claims, Professor Wallace has solid Christian form. But that's really not the point. What I really find so distasteful is how Christians hold the Jesus of history in such contempt. Do you really think that these little men would be so brave if they'd been talking about the Prophet Muhammad? Common names. By far, the most common objection that Christian pseudo-academics use to discredit the Jesus family tomb is the idea that the Jesus family names are common, with the direct implication that a group of common names is in itself common.
They found. Let's just presume for sake of argument it really is a 1st century tomb they found near Jerusalem. Okay. The names they found kind of graffitied on the side of these ossuaries. Yeshua, Jesus. Joseph. Miriam or Miriamne, Mary. I think there's Mara, which might be short for Martha. There's also Judah, son of Jesus. Well, all these names, Jesus, Joseph, Mary, Judah, are among the commonest names in 1st century Palestine.
The gist of the response to the Talpiot tomb claim is that these names were too common to make anything out of it. That, first of all, the location of the tomb for being a family tomb of Jesus is in the wrong place. He lived in Galilee.
In this tomb.
These names at this time were very, very common. They were very popular names. They were related to the Hasmonean family that was famous during the Maccabean struggle that liberated Israel from Greek control.
Why? Because the names of Mary, Jesus, and Joseph were some of the most common of the era. But even if it does say Jesus, son of Joseph, such inscriptions were found on many ancient tombs because the names were so common. Because the names were so common. Because the names were so common. Because the names were so common.
Only a total moron could say something so mathematically and historically illiterate. There are just under 2,800 personal names in the Hebrew Bible, and in the 1st century, even Hasmoneans were using Greek names as well as Hebrew. So in reality, 1st century parents had thousands of names to choose from for their children. Unfortunately, Stephen Fan and William Lane Craig don't understand the difference between frequency and possibility. Let me explain what I mean. If you roll a pair of dice 100 times and get a pair of threes 50 times, that doesn't mean that some of the other numbers on the cube disappear. Similarly, just because the name Yeshua is found on 21 of the 600 ossuaries, it doesn't mean that parents in the 1st century Southern Levant just lost out on 21 other names. In their video debunking the Lost Tomb documentary, Fan and Craig limit their pool of names to 16 by dishonestly telling their grateful Christian audience that there were only 286 ossuaries and that 16 are popular names, so therefore the people of the 1st century Southern Levant only had 16 names to choose from. Either these pseudo-academics are stupid or they're con men. I'll let you decide. For the sake of demonstration, even if we limit ourselves to Fan and Craig's ridiculous conclusion, if we say that parents in 1st century Judah really did only have 16 names to choose from, to find a specific group of 5 names is over 1,000,000 to 1. No evidence left. I know it must seem like I'm picking on poor old Fan, but he's a gift that just keeps on giving, simply because he's so bad at lying. Only someone not accustomed to lying could be this bad.
There's no way that we can actually connect the James ossuary with that tomb, and the evidence should just end right there.
Sure, it's true that Cluner and co. have done their very best to lose any useful evidence for the Jesus family tomb, but the lady doth protest too much, methinks, as Queen Gertrude said. In actual fact, recent published papers have shown that the James ossuary did originally come from the Jesus family tomb. Both the patina and the soil samples agree. But what's really interesting is Fan's Freudian slip.
Evidence should just end right there. Evidence should just end right there. Evidence should just end right there.
He meant to say he wishes the speculation would stop, and I don't blame him. But he can't help himself saying that he wishes the evidence would just stop appearing. The IAA know best. After the 12-year James Ossuary trial, the entire world had to admit that the Israeli Antiquities Authority had lost any kind of credibility. You would think that Cluner and co. would just hang their collective heads in shame, but no.
Professionally, I'm insulted. Believe me, we are doing our best way to document all the findings in the right way they appeared. And the 10th ossuary was a plain one. But to blame us that we have smuggled or we didn't pay attention or allowed to steal it, that's a real blame, and I will not accept.
You've got to admire the little guy for his chutzpah. Using the word professional in the same context of the Jesus family tomb really does take some nerve. He refuses to accept any kind of responsibility for totally screwing up the Jesus family tomb excavation, despite the fact that the Israeli people were paying him to do just that, to take responsibility. And the sad thing is, the Christians watching his little speech will feel sorry for him. What about Simcha Yakobovici, who had to take Josias to court for worse insults? Luckily, he got awarded $266,000 for his trouble. But what about James Tabor, who is a true gentleman? Thanks to Cluner, he's been mauled by the attack dogs of Christian pseudo-academia. The sign of Jonah. It's true that the chevron on the facade of a tomb has nothing to do with Christianity, early or otherwise, but it's a lie to say that it's a common image and has nothing to do with Jonah.
What about the Talpiot tomb? Shimon Gibson explains that although he was mystified by the Talpiot tomb's facade when he first saw it in his youth, since then he has noticed many other tombs with a similar motif.
You have a kind of sort of repetition of certain motifs. One of them is the gable, so you have this kind of chevron. Sometimes they have, and if you look at the one from the Talpiot tomb, its upper part it doesn't end in a point of the triangle, but actually curves around, and that is because it's supposed to represent. Sometimes it's a burial urn or some kind of motif which is at the angles of the pediment or the gable.
Taking a closer look at the original sketches of the Talpiot tomb, we discover that its facade is different from the mark that was found at Dominus Flevit. We also learn that this motif was a common artistic design in the 1st century.
Into the tomb. What do you make of that?
Yes, that's a very interesting point. There is a pointed gable with a circle beneath it over the entrance to the Talpiot tomb. And it is suggested in the documentary that this was an early Jewish Christian symbol. That couldn't be more wrong. This symbol is found on Jewish coins that predate Jesus' ministry, found on coins that are even earlier than that, coins produced by Philip, Herod the Great's son. We find this imagery on other Jewish bone boxes or ossuaries.
The coins that William Lane Craig and Craig Evans produce as evidence are in reality Roman coins. These examples are Trajan coins, and you can clearly see that they are same as the Christian examples offered by our two pseudo-academics. The Second Temple had a flat roof, not a gabled Roman roof, and there's no way that a Hebrew family with Hasmonean names just before the Great War against Rome would have used Roman religious symbols on their coffins. On Jewish coins of the period, we can see that symbols are used on many levels. Even within Jewish scripture, our texts have meanings within meanings that are referred to as Peshat, Remez, Drush and Sod. Sod is the secret and deepest meaning. In all of Jewish history, the story of Jonah was never used as a metaphor for resurrection. From the 2nd century BCE, the Judeans started to believe fanatically in the end of days and the physical resurrection of the dead, but it never once occurred to anyone to use Jonah as a metaphor for the resurrection. Why? Because Jonah is a metaphor for emunah, for deep faith in God. The chevron sign is many things. On one level it could be a reference to Jonah, but also on another level, a deeper level, it's a reference to the letter Shin, which represents the secret name of God, El Shaddai. I know I keep picking on Fan, but I just can't help it. In this clip we see Christian cognitive dissonance at its most pathetic.
We came in and just said, you know, it's amazing that there's an actual chevron on the side of one of these ossuaries. Mm-hmm. And so when we came in, we looked for this ossuary without the lid on it and with the symbol on the side. And the producer, who was with us at the time, pointed out, well, there it is up there. And when I looked up, he said, but there's a lid on it. And, oh, it doesn't have this mark on the lid. Well, you know, I would hope that if this was a stonemason's mark, that maybe it would be on the lid as well. Mm-hmm. And I looked, and I said, well, look on the other side and see if there's a symbol like that. And he says, yeah, sure enough. There it is. And I said, well, why don't you pick it up and turn it around? So you take the thing and very carefully turn it around, like so. And voila, it's exactly the same as the one above. Yeah. So at that point we realized that this went from being a very important religious symbol to being simply a stonemason's mark like all the others that we've seen here. A stonemason's mark like all the others that we've seen here. A stonemason's mark like all the others that we've seen here.
Fan is trying to imply that Simcha was hiding the fact that an ossuary, which they'd found in Jerusalem, had a chevron and circle logo on the side, but also had the same logo on the lid. He repeats an assertion that he obviously must have heard someone else make, which must have sounded impressive to him at the time, but he hadn't actually yet had the time to test the theory. Unfortunately for Fan, he tests his theory out on camera. He asserts that the logo is just a mason's mark and it's only intended to show which way the lid fits. The cameraman dutifully shows us the ossuary with the lid fitting correctly, and then in his great ta-da moment, Fan turns the lid around to show the similar logo on the lid, which is now above the logo on the side of the ossuary. Hilariously, you can tell that Fan realises too late that the lid doesn't fit in that position as he desperately fiddles with it in an attempt to recover what's left of his sizable dignity, but also knows in his heart of heart that his Christian audience will be so desperate to believe him that they'll never notice, so he just soldiers on. Must get 10 out of 10 for pure chutzpah on that one. With regard to the use of the chevron and circle as a stonemason's mark, how do you explain that the logo was used on the facade of the tomb? Would the mason put the sign on the tomb as well? How do these pseudo-academics account for the fact that some of these logos, different logos, are intricate art specific to each ossuary? How do they account for the fact that not all of the ossuaries in the Jesus family tomb share the same logo? Had the Jesus family been shopping around for cheap ossuaries?
You will have noticed that this video doesn't say anything about the resurrection, neither disproves it or proves it. We just gave you the facts. It's up to you to work out what is true. But just as a note, contrary to the popular belief, the Shroud of Turin is, in our opinion, proof that something extraordinary happened to the Jesus of history's body after he died.
We're planning a video analysis of the latest evidence that debunks the myth that it's a forgery. Subscribe to make sure that you're notified when we are able to release it.